Hello, you're listening to Hear This Idea, a podcast showcasing new thinking at the University of Cambridge and beyond. In this episode, we talk to Dr. Sriya Iyer, who is a university reader in economics and fellow of St. Catherine's College, Cambridge. Sriya was one of my absolute favourite supervisors, so I was incredibly excited to get to talk to her about her research on the economics of religion. At the core of it, the economics of religion tries to answer three fundamental questions. The first question is understanding what determines religiosity. It was long thought that as countries get richer, they also become more secular. But Sriya notes that in reality, it is much more complicated than that. Despite many developing countries having had consistently high GDP growth, religiosity has actually increased. Sriya believes that much of this is because the benefits of growth have been distributed very unequally, leading religious organisations to play a really important role in providing public goods. The second question that this field examines is how religion may be described as social capital, that is, to what degree it fosters a shared sense of identity and trust amongst individuals. Lastly, the third question is what the micro and macro consequences of religion are. Perhaps most famously, Max Weber proposed back in 1904 that the Protestant work ethic was an essential component of modern-day capitalism, and we briefly discuss what modern studies have to say about this. We then spend much more time on Sriya's own work, first talking about how religion affects fertility decisions, and then how religious riots affect political elections in India. One aspect I think every budding researcher should listen to is Sriya talking about her own personal experiences of doing fieldwork and what impact actually meeting the people she was studying had on her. This was a really fascinating conversation, and we cover a lot of ground. I think all of it is very much understandable to non-economists, but if you ever feel a bit lost, especially with visualizing some of the theory, do have a look at our write-up, which contains some more detailed explanations and diagrams. But without any further ado, here's the episode.
So my name is Sriya Iyer, and I'm a development economist at the Faculty of Economics at the University of Cambridge. I'm also a fellow of St. Catherine's College here, and I work in areas such as development, health, education, and religion.
And out of interest, what made you want to be an economist in the first place?
So I think I was very interested in inequality. Being Indian, being brought up both in the United States and in India, I saw two very different societies at an early stage of my life. So that inequality was something that I was really interested in, different countries. But I was also interested in issues surrounding social diversity. And these were the reasons why I thought economics might be an interesting subject to investigate and to study in order to learn more about inequality as well as to learn more about social diversity.
And as you said, one of the areas that you're working on now is the economics of religion, which is what we'll be talking about in this episode. How did you come to discover this field of economics, and what is it?
So I think, we know that religion is a really big global phenomenon. 84% of the world today say that they have a religious affiliation. So as a phenomenon, it was clearly very interesting to me and to others. But I also thought that economists had actually said less about this particular subject than probably many other disciplines, such as philosophy and theology and history and sociology. So one of the reasons I got into the area of the economics of religion was because I felt that perhaps economists could say a little more about contributing to global dialogues about religion, and that maybe this was an area where one could also learn about other disciplines as well as economics while you're actually understanding economic phenomena.
And I'm sure some of the listeners, when they kind of hear this term, right, economics of religion, are a bit taken aback because it seems like a very weird combination, right? When we think of economics, we think of very rational decision making. And when we think of religion, that is a very emotional, spiritual aspects of people's lives. How can these two things work together? And what can economics really tell us about religion?
No, that's absolutely true. I think normally if you hear the expression economics of religion, as you say, it sounds very odd to put these two words together. We think of religion very much as based on individual faith. We think it's about spirituality. It's very much about service. There are moral dimensions, ethical dimensions, and so forth. And then we think about a subject like economics, which is very much about costs and benefits and incentives and competition. And somehow these two ideas and words don't really seem to go very well with each other. But I think what we're arguing in this field is that there are economic theories and statistical tools that you can apply to understand the evolution of religion in society. And that's really what the economics of religion is trying to do. It's not really asking, fundamental questions such as how do I attain salvation? We're leaving that to philosophers and others. What we're really asking is, rather practical questions such as what are the costs and benefits to me to believe in salvation? So the concerns of the economist of religion is actually much more perhaps prosaic and practical rather than very noble and spiritual. But nevertheless, we do think that economics does have something to offer the broadest dialogues about religion.
So I know next to nothing about the economics of religion. Can you maybe give some examples of these more prosaic questions which you're trying to answer?
So we're looking at things such as incentives, what makes people want to be members of a particular religious organization, for example. What is the role of religion in people's lives? Does it help with well-being? Does it help with mental health issues, physical health issues? More broadly, are we really interested in things like inequality? Does religion actually, is it influenced by economic inequality? In turn, does it influence inequality? This is really some of the questions that economists would be concerned with. And of course, the biggest question, which I think underlies all economics of religion studies, is how does this actually relate to economic growth? Because we know that we've seen rapid economic growth right across the world. But at the same time, we've also seen an increase in the influence of religion. And some people would have predicted that actually with lots of secularization and economic growth and scientific developments, there should be less belief in the irrational rather than more. Whereas that's really the big paradox that we're seeing, that there's an increase in religiosity with economic growth. So that's the sort of the much bigger, deeper question that this field is investigating.
Right. Well, that is an amazing segue, because that is actually one of the questions I really wanted to talk about, is that relationship between wealth and growth. Because as you said, I guess from a very European perspective as well, we have this image that as countries get richer, people get less religious. But as you've pointed out, and as some studies have pointed out as well, the image really isn't as clear. Could you talk a bit about why you think this pattern, which held in Europe, isn't holding out for the rest of the world, and maybe highlight a couple of the anomalies that really stick out there?
Yes, no, that's absolutely true. I think overall, the richer countries have become more secular over time, but the world as a whole has actually become more religious, and studies have actually pointed this out. I think there are, of course, big exceptions, like the United States, which is both the richest country in the world as well as the most religious country in the world. So this is why this relationship is actually quite complex. One of the reasons why we economists think that religion might continue to be really important in very different parts of the world is also because it might be related to other factors, such as provision of public goods, so things like education and healthcare and credit and other things. And if religious organizations are providing some of access to what economists call these kinds of public goods, then it could be that religions are actually becoming important, not just because of the faith-based ideas that they're promoting, but also because of these services which they're providing, which is really the kind of work that I've been doing, for example.
So you've mentioned as well that inequality, right, plays a big role in this. Can you talk a bit more about why that might be a better measure than growth in understanding this relationship?
Yes. I think one of the reasons why we've seen this rise in religiosity and religion while you're also experiencing greater economic growth is because, as our macroeconomics has shown us, with economic growth, you always get a lot of inequality, as increasing inequality as well. And my feeling is that as populations are becoming more aspirational, as this income inequality is actually rising in many different parts of the world, developing countries, emerging economies, and so forth, the demand for all of these services is actually rising too. Everyone wants their kids to have good education, good health. You want people to have access to credit, good labor market opportunities, and so forth. And I think in parts of the world where sometimes the state is not providing some of these services as well or in full supply as we might like, other entities are stepping in, amongst them the religious organizations. And this is, of course, contributing both to the spread of religion as well as to the spread of the strength of these organizations, because they're also providing these services in turn in response to the demand that is coming with the rise in income inequality. That's really how I see inequality also linking to the strength of religion.
So we'll delve into these public goods things in a second. But before we do that, I wanted to ask as well if you can maybe explain one of the theoretical models that is used to predict why we might expect that wealth and religion have this inverse relationship.
I think the very simple way to kind of think about it without getting too technical is, yes, we do think that, there are individuals who, can spend their time in work and they can spend their time in leisure, religious activities and others, for example, and that essentially there may be a trade-off between the time you spend in these other activities and the time that you might actually be spending in work. And there are many different models, actually, that have thought about religion in that kind of context. And if you're thinking about it in that kind of context, then there are some arguments that have suggested, and it's mainly come from sociologists rather than economists, that some religions might actually encourage thrift and savings and incentives towards hard work, which has then eventually contributed to higher economic growth in some parts of the world historically. So I think that's really one way of actually thinking about the link between income and religion. Certain religions might actually prescribe certain ways in which work is done, which can then influence savings, investments, and ultimately we know those factors then affect growth and subsequently inequality.
This sounds a lot like what I've heard about Weber's Protestant work ethic.
Yeah.
Is that idea still floating around, and how has that literature developed?
That idea is very much at the heart of the economics of religion. Yes, you're absolutely right. It is Max Weber's idea of the Protestant work ethic. Many contemporary economists, like Robert Barrow and Rachel McCleary and others, have done a lot of work at looking at religion and economic growth, testing the Weber hypothesis for many different countries. And I think that really is one aspect which people are looking at, both at country level and at the individual level. Is it just that there are certain religious norms and beliefs that might encourage certain kinds of work activity, certain kinds of behaviors that then might eventually contribute to economic growth? Then again, there's another strand of research which is saying, well, does the economic growth and the inequality and so forth itself contribute to changes in religion? That's the kind of work that I and others have been doing, which has been looking more at how the inequality then comes back to looking at religion. And of course, if you look at different parts of the world, if you take Islam, for example, there's some body of research that's also been looking at how certain theological principles in the religion might be influencing things like interest, maybe influencing financial markets, legal institutions in some countries, and that this might also explain some kind of disparities that you see between different parts of the world. So there's lots of different kinds of research that goes on within this umbrella of economics of religion. We're focused more on what economics says about religion, but you've also got this other area of what religion might actually, say about various economic decisions as well.
You mentioned the work by Barrow and McCleary. So interestingly, one of the things that they found is that it's actually very specific religious beliefs that are correlated with increased growth. Can you talk a bit about what those beliefs are and why we think it is them that increase economic growth and not others? So
in their work, it was very much about the belief in heaven, the belief in the afterlife and so forth, that is, important for economic growth. Having said that, there is also a lot of diversity across religions in that, some religions do prescribe church attendance on a regular basis. Others don't prescribe that. So actually looking at both dimensions, looking at both beliefs, and how that might affect growth, as well as what I think they call belonging, which is a church attendance and actually attending a place of worship. Both of these aspects might actually influence economic growth as well in different ways for different religions.
At the moment, we've kind of framed it as the economy affecting religion. But as you rightfully said, religion can also affect individual decisions. And one of those things that it can affect is fertility. Can you talk very briefly about the literature there and your own work in that as well?
Sure. So this is actually a major topic that many other disciplines have addressed, notably people who work in the field of demography, sociology, history. There is the view that if we're looking at the effect of religion on fertility behavior, then it can actually work through different channels. It could work through some kind of what I think as an economist I would call a pure religion effect, that there are theological beliefs in a religion that might influence people in terms of when they get married, how many children they have, whether or not they're using contraception or not. So that's one channel. But then there's also another channel in terms of socioeconomic characteristics, that different religious groups might actually demonstrate different educational characteristics, land ownership characteristics, other characteristics. And that also, of course, influences through a kind of income effect how many children you might have. And it's really, if you're looking at the effect of religion on demographic behavior in this way, you're actually looking at the balance between these various effects, a sort of pure religion effect compared to something that's being driven by education and socioeconomic characteristics. And that's really what I tested when I was doing my PhD here in Cambridge, many years ago now. I went to South India, did some field work there, and we were essentially trying to establish for Hindus, Muslims, and Christians in South India whether this pure religion effect mattered or mattered more than the socioeconomic effects. And it just the postage stamp version of the findings that we found was that essentially, yes, religion did matter. It did matter for Hindus and Muslims and Christians and others, but that the effect of religion was mediated by socioeconomic characteristics, which meant that if you had two people from two different religions who were both educated, highly educated, then you didn't see any difference in the fertility rates. So a very highly educated Hindu woman and a very highly educated Muslim woman would both be having similar numbers of children. So it was not that religion was not important, it was important, but its effect is mediated by the effect of the socioeconomic characteristics. And so you need to control for the economic characteristics before you can make a claim that it's only religion that's important. That's really what I was arguing at the time.
And especially in the Indian context, this has a very important political dimension as well, right? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, it does. So in India, it's, for listeners who might or might not know, it's a Hindu majority country. So about 80% of the population is Hindu, 15% of the population is Muslim, and Christians and others are about 3%. So although the Muslim community is 15% of the population, it's 15% of 1.2 billion. So we're talking about millions of people here, even if they are a minority community. And there have been across the decades in India lots of debates about Hindu fertility and Muslim fertility, and which communities' fertility rates have been growing faster or not, as the case may be, and why, and so forth. And that has often created political aspects to these issues as well. But I think the underlying argument which the economists have always been making in the Indian context, and I think that does continue to hold, is that this very much depends upon levels of education. And for example, in the sample that I was looking at, on average, the Muslim women had much lower education than the Hindu women and were therefore demonstrating higher fertility in that sample. And this is true, overall in the country as well. So I think the key thing here is I've always been arguing that, yes, though this relationship between religion and demography does have, political connotations, and it can be, the information from these studies can be used in various ways, it's really important to look at the economics. And it's really important to look at characteristics like education and female labor force participation, land ownership, credit access, and these other factors, which we know affects demographic behavior anyway.
And the other really interesting result is there's a gendered aspect to it as well, right? When religion does have an effect, it has a very gendered effect. Can you talk about that and the daughter aversion finding that you found in your paper?
Yes. So this is an interesting aspect of this religion and demography literature, because on the one hand, it's usually argued that communities that have very high infant mortality also demonstrate very high fertility. So if you're losing a lot of children to child death, you're likely to replace them quickly. Now, what's interesting in the Indian context is that the community that has the higher fertility, in this case, it's the Muslim community, actually have much lower female infant mortality. So that's an interesting paradox. So what we're finding in some of these data is that it's not actually consistent with the broader demographic theory that the community that has the higher infant mortality has the higher fertility. We're actually showing that where female infant mortality is concerned, it's actually lower amongst the Muslim community than it is amongst the Hindu community for various cultural and other reasons. And so I think when we're looking at demography, of course it's about fertility, mortality, and migration. So if you're looking at the mortality aspect of it and you're focusing on infant and child mortality, then there is this gendered difference by religion, which seems to me to be quite interesting, and also suggests quite a range of interesting policy outcomes as well. Because on the one hand, you may ask communities to control their fertility if you feel the country has an overpopulation problem. But on the other hand, if female mortality is actually much lower in a particular community, that's a sign of a good thing. If the female mortality is actually low. So it's getting that balance right between your fertility policy and your mortality policy, and how you're going to reconcile that with religion. It's a tricky question, but it's definitely something that's at least I felt in previous research was worth investigating.
So now to move to a different but tricky topic. You mentioned before that religion plays a really important role in the developing world for providing these non-religious services. And this is something I want to unpack and maybe talk a bit about the theory and then talk about a bit about the evidence that you found for this as well. But let's start by maybe setting the picture, because one of the things that is super interesting about your work as well is that you do an awful lot of field work. You're out there interviewing people and really gaining an insight as well for what it means for what religion is, right, in the developing world. Could you briefly talk a bit about those experiences, maybe those challenges as well that you faced in collecting those interviews and collecting the actual data that you would then analyze?
Yes, I mean, I think this actually started when I was a PhD student. I was wanting to do a PhD, as I just explained, in religion and demography. At that time, I didn't have access to a lot of data. And so I was told by my wonderful PhD supervisor at the time, Sheila Ogilvy, that I should go out there and collect it. So that's how I ended up spending, actually very early on in my career, a whole year in South India, collecting the data for my PhD. And that actually got me very interested in surveys, because I actually met some very eminent Indian sociologists who were working in the region that I was working in Karnataka and South India. And they explained to me the importance of doing survey-based research and integrating it with the statistical and the economic theory research that I had been trained in Cambridge. And so that's when I started getting into the whole idea of using survey research and in some ways blending it with the statistical analysis that we're taught to do as economists. And I think the greatest reward of doing survey-based research is that you are actually out there in the real world talking to people, getting a real world understanding of what their concerns are. And you have a much better understanding of issues as well as people. And if you like doing that kind of research, I think it's very important to go out there and do that kind of work. The greatest challenge of doing it, certainly in my case, was I wasn't trained to do it. I wasn't trained in sociology. I didn't have the skills initially to know how to do good survey-based research and good qualitative interviews. And so that was a very steep learning experience for me at the time. And I think with surveys, you always keep learning. Nowadays, of course, not all surveys are in person. A lot of my colleagues and others, they use online surveys and they're collecting data of using telephone surveys and other surveys. But if you're doing it sort of the old-fashioned way, which is actually going and talking to people, and you're in their homes and you're having discussions with them, I think it's actually hugely rewarding. You learn a lot. You learn about what the important questions are to ask, which you can then go back to Cambridge or wherever, and you can sit down with your survey data and then think about how to analyze it. So I think there are rewards in terms of it's teaching you new skills, you're learning about the real world, and there are challenges in terms of knowing how to do it best. Of course, we make lots of mistakes when we do surveys. I remember when I did my very first survey, again for my PhD, and I gave it to a very eminent Indian sociologist who had done many of these surveys to look at. And he looked at all of my questions, and then he took a red pen and he put, marks right through many of my questions and said, you cannot possibly go to someone and ask a question like that. You have to reword it this way. And so, you sort of learn, learning by doing and consulting with others, how exactly to ask questions in an appropriate way to the people that you're talking to.
This must be like very sensitive areas to ask questions about. There's like this quote of for a dinner table conversations, you should never talk about politics, religion, and money. And I'm guessing those are the exact three topics, right?
Those are all the topics I work on.
Are people generally very open about this, or is it hard to kind of get to the truth of these things?
So I think most people, if they know that you're a genuine surveyor and you're interested in the welfare of the people that you're talking to, are actually very open and honest about their opinions on the questions. This is why I think, the manner in which you ask the questions is also important. If they know that you're sincere about your scholarship and that, you're doing it for the welfare of the community, they will, invariably tell you, what they think. At the same time, when you're designing surveys, and this is what people who do, and very often nowadays, I tend to work with survey organizations that have a lot of experience in designing surveys. You also include various questions in the survey to make sure that what economists call the difference between stated preferences and revealed preferences. Some people may just say things in a survey because they think that's what the interviewer wants to hear. But if you design the survey in a very effective way, you will probably be able to get at the revealed preference as well as the stated preference. And that's really the art of doing the surveys, I think.
Can you maybe give an example of something important that you learned from this fieldwork and from conducting these surveys that you wouldn't have learned just from looking at the numerical data?
I think, I remember in the very first set of surveys I did, it was a hot afternoon in Ramnagaram Taluk in Karnataka. And I was interviewing, this lady about her past and when she got married, the number of children she had and so forth. We were actually sitting outside her, little home. And it was, I remember it was a very hot afternoon. And suddenly in the middle, she burst out crying. And I was very worried because I thought maybe I had asked some question that had offended her. And I was asking about her life and so forth. And she simply burst out crying. And then I was very upset at the time. And I looked at her and I said, I'm so sorry, why are you crying? Have I offended you? And she said, no, you haven't offended me at all. She said, I'm crying because I wonder when you're asking me these questions, how will it actually change my life? How will your doing your survey actually change my life? Will it change my life? And I think that was, one of the most profound moments for me when I was doing the work, because I realized at that point that when you are doing the work, it's very important that once you've done it, that it does actually change someone's life in a good way at the end of it. So for example, when I finished that survey in the PhD and so forth, I was very particular to feed it back to that particular, district of India to make sure that, some of the recommendations that came out of the thesis could actually be implemented. But that episode when she said, burst into tears and said to me, how is it actually going to change my life? I mean, that has stayed with me, as you can see, 20 years on, simply because I think it reinforced, why we do what we do.
Can you explain a bit about what non-religious services look like in the developing world?
Yes. So I think here, when we're thinking about non-religious services, we should clarify we're calling them non-religious, but they're essentially welfare services of various kinds. So it's things like education and healthcare, credit, employment, childcare. And if we're kind of parceling that out, it's things like blood donation camps, flood relief, microcredit schemes, cow lending schemes. It's all of these activities that religious organizations are providing. That's really what we're thinking of when we're talking about non-religious services. And the reason these welfare services are important is because, both there's a supply side constraint in terms of, lack of state provision, but there's also a demand side in that populations now are very aspirational. And because they're very aspirational, they have a demand for all of these services. Someone has to provide them. If the state is not providing them adequately, then other entities will step in. I'm arguing that in countries like India and other parts of the world, the religious organizations are now playing quite a big role in providing these services. And these could be, basic education services. It could be something like health. It could be sari distribution. It could be computer classes. It could be English language classes. We found one temple in Western India that was even providing aerobics classes for younger devotees because this was a demand in the area. So when we're thinking about these non-religious services, we're really thinking about a very broad range of welfare services.
Maybe a silly question, but this makes me wonder, why isn't it just secular institutions that are stepping in to provide these services? It'd be strange, for instance, if my local church started putting on yoga classes and teaching kids computing and so on. So why isn't that the case in the developing world?
I think the secular institutions are. I mean, there are many NGOs and others that are, operating, providing the same services. But I think the demand is very high, and there's a room for lots of different entities, essentially, to provide services. The interesting thing about religious organizations and why I think they've been quite successful in providing these services is because they have legitimacy. Both with the masses, and they also have legitimacy with the state. Many of these organizations are funded by community donations, and in order to provide these services, what I argue is that it's quite costly. So we interviewed, for example, something I describe in my recent book, several mosques in India that are providing food distribution services, Hindu temples that are providing food distribution services. Very often they may have anywhere between 100 to 500 people, coming in for lunch on a given day, and providing these services is actually quite costly. And so I think the religious organizations, they have the funds in many cases to do this through community donations, and they have the legitimacy to do it both with the masses and the state. And this is why I think that, they're quite, they are there. They may not be the dominant player in these markets, but I think there's room for lots of players essentially to provide these services.
And then this might be like a very obvious question, but why do they provide it then? Like, why does a church feel obligated or a temple feel obligated to provide these services if, as you said, they are very costly to provide?
So I think so this is a question actually we asked in our surveys, which is described in my book, The Economics of Religion in India, which came out about a year and a half ago. Now, the overarching motive for a religious organization is spirituality service. This is the main motive. And so for many religious organizations, providing these services may seem a moral obligation in itself, on the one hand. And that is very well established. But on the other hand, what I'm arguing in my book is that in addition to this very important moral obligation and reason for providing these services, in societies where you have many different religions and groups within religions that are competing with each other, there is also this competition motive, which might also be influencing the provision of the services. Now, this is where, we're getting into ideas from economics, which might not sit that comfortably with the idea of a religious organization as a not-for-profit organization. But essentially we had a whole bunch of questions which we asked organizations about how much they knew about other welfare services being provided either by other organizations and sects within their own religion or other religions in their local area. And something that I document in my book is how much and what detailed knowledge a temple or a mosque had about everybody else who was providing services in their local area. And it wasn't just about other institutions within their own religion. They also knew what other religions were providing. And so what I'm arguing is that it's both the moral dimension, the service dimension, the faith dimension that is pushing the provision of the services. But increasingly, we documented at least this small competition dimension as well, which I think is also motivating the provision of the service.
And just to clarify the nature of that competition, is the thought that if some other religious sect provides these non-religious services and we don't, then people are going to move away from us and towards them, and that's a bad thing?
So the economic theories from the economics of religion would argue that the non-religious service provision is related at some level to conversion. That if you are providing these services, then and this competition may be either within a religion or across religion. In the Indian context, there's not as much conversion as you see in the United States, but it's more competition between sects within the same religion. So what they would argue here is that the reason they're providing some of these services is that, and you have a sort of religious offering, which obviously people will choose in terms of deciding whether to join a particular religious organization, but the non-religious services might also influence their decision making to a degree. I think that's really where the non-religious services are then linked into this broader idea of why they're providing the services, and it's links to conversion.
So there's a really interesting flip side of this kind of topic, which is we now realize, right, that for individuals, it can be very beneficial to be part of a religious community. And this has led Yanakoni to say that religion might actually be a club good. Can you briefly explain first, maybe to non-econ listeners, what a club good is, and then explain what he means by that?
Yes. So we've been talking till now quite a lot about this broad area of public goods, so like education and so forth. Now, one type of public good is something that we call a club good. And what we mean by a club good is, the sort of technical definition is that it is excludable but non-rivalrous. And what that means is that it's a good that has, high excludability. You can include people in the good and exclude people in the good, but it is, everyone can actually consume it. There's very little rivalry in terms of consumption of the good. And religion is a great example of a club good because, by its very definition, if you can be included in a religious group or excluded from a religious group. You can't prevent someone else from consuming it if they want to, but you can exclude people from the group through various means. And what Yanakone and others were arguing is that sometimes if you see religious organizations prescribing things like a particular way to dress or a particular way to eat or dietary restrictions or these kinds of things, that's the way in which they are including and excluding people and influencing membership of the organization as well.
There's a really interesting paper on this by Berman. Can you briefly explain what Berman tested to see if this model was onto something?
So he was really looking at ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, and he was trying to explain why, when you had broader changes in the labor market outside, why was it that people were studying in the yeshiva, in the religious schools, long after when you would have thought that they would be studying. And he applies this model essentially to show that they were demonstrating commitment to the religion in some ways by continuing in the religious school. I mean, the club goods model is a very important way of thinking about religion. Of course, it originally comes from the ideas by Buchanan and others. Actually, from George Mason University, many of the ideas came out of that school. It's the whole idea of public choice, but it's been applied to a range of areas, including religion. And the idea here in the religious context, both with and Berman's paper, of course, is just testing the club goods model in the context of a particular in the context of a particular community. You also have other work, for example, by Daniel Chen, who was looking at the Indonesian financial crisis. And, he found in his work, for example, that when you had the Indonesian financial crisis, there was an increase in religiosity shown by, attending madrasas. And it's the same kind of phenomena, testing this whole club goods idea and how, outside economic circumstances might then influence the, uptake and the increase in religiosity.
I think it might be beneficial for listeners to just explain a bit more concretely maybe how this kind of club good works and how like the signaling aspect of it works as well.
So the idea here is that, if you join a religious organization, there may be a tendency to what economists call free ride. So you don't demonstrate your commitment to the religion, and essentially, some are demonstrating their commitment more than others. So what this whole class of models was really trying to say is that you needed to signal your commitment to the religion. And the way you could actually signal your commitment to the religion was, you could do this by higher donations, by changes in dress, by dietary restrictions, and doing that signaling essentially signal to other members of the religion that you were highly faithful to, to the religious proposition, essentially.
And just to spell it out, that this signal or this commitment needs to be costly in some way as well. That not everyone will do it, in the sense that choosing to dress in a certain way or choosing to have dietary restrictions in a certain way is costly.
Yes.
So that only people who really believe it would be willing to make this trade-off, and that way you can kind of separate between the free riders and the actual believers in the religion.
And that's a really important point. And this is important because, that's where the notion of the sacrifice, which you talked about earlier, Luca, comes in. Because, you have to be willing to demonstrate your commitment by making the sacrifice, whatever the nature of that sacrifice might be.
Okay, this is definitely a silly question. But when I think about free riders, I think about people who are like consuming but not contributing towards some good, right? So if I just, take free public transport but don't pay any taxes, I'm free riding. But in the case of religion, I can imagine, my local church would think, look, the more people we have in our congregation, the better. And we don't need to impose any costs on joining, come right in. So in other words, what is this costly good that we want to screen free riders away from in the case of religion?
It's a religious good that you're buying into at one level. But for most religious organizations, they are also surviving on community donations. So, people may be signaling their commitment to a particular religious organization, but frequently they're also contributing either their money or their time to the organization as well. So the reason that an organization would want more adherence is because, I know we were talking earlier about providing all of these services and so forth. The organization also needs support, and that comes from the community of people who believe in it. If we're looking at this, purely in sort of very mechanistic economic terms, we would say that it was, either because of political support or because of monetary support or some of these factors that the organization wants the membership of all the adherents.
Maybe to very briefly give an example to listeners in the UK as well, and this is a bit of an anecdote, but I know a lot of primary schools in the UK are run by churches, and those are often the very good primary schools, which have a fixed number of places. So theoretically, not every kid can go to one of these. So one of the requirements is that the child, along with their parents, turn up to church every Sunday. And that would be a very, costly signal in the sense that it's some time that you need to sacrifice. And people who also find going to church not as costly, because for them it is a legitimate spiritual thing, rather than free riding just to get into school, that helps to get rid of some of them.
That's a great example. Yeah. So I think this issue about religious schooling in general is an important issue in different parts of the world. Whether you're looking at Catholic schools in the US and the UK, whether you're looking at madrasas in India and Pakistan, or whether you're looking at the yeshiva in the Israeli context, the issues are actually very similar in all of this. It's the whole question of religious schooling, how it fits with secular schooling, and how it responds to wider changes in economic circumstances. The big debate at the moment, actually, as I see it, is really about where religious schooling and secular schooling actually fit with each other. So in India, for example, it is a secular schooling system, but there's also 5% of the Indian school-going population currently goes to a religious school, and that's for various reasons. And so one of the issues you want to think about is whether religious schooling complements secular schooling, and how, for certain populations, and what are the issues around that. In other parts of the world, you're thinking about integrating a religious schooling system with a secular schooling system. People come from different schools, but the labor market is open. In the Indian context, if people have gone exclusively through the religious schooling system, then they're not able to compete directly in the open labor market. So that's causing other big issues for policymakers and others to be thinking about. So the reason that we're actually interested in the whole religious school issue is how it actually fits with broader debates in the economics of education and broader debates about secular schooling.
And what might some of the solutions to this be then?
So I think, my way of actually looking at the issue, Luca, is that you have to think about it as religious schooling and secular schooling being complementary to each other rather than in competition. I mean, that's really how I would think about it. So, for example, in the South Indian state of Kerala, there's a very successful model where children attend a religious school in the morning, and then, from say 5 to 7, then they go into a secular school a bit later. And that complementarity allows parents to make sure their children have the religious education that they feel maybe they want for their children, and the secular education, which then ensures the employability later on when they graduate. So I think one of the big issues in this context is this idea of for me, I think this complementarity between the religious education and secular education is actually quite crucial when you're thinking about policy, and it's going to be, I think, quite crucial if the number of people who are attending religious schools in developing countries going forward rises, as in some countries it is. So I think that's really why this issue is important. The other issue is whether some of this religious instruction is actually happening in the secular school or not, if there is demand for it. So in a country like India, for example, it's a secular schooling system, but there's the majority religion, very significant minority religions, and so forth. Ideally, what you would want is that all kids of all religions get education about all the religions. But if that's not possible, then how do you use the religious education system as a complement to the secular education system, so that parents feel that the demand for education, whatever it is, religious or secular, is being met appropriately.
So we've talked about a lot of different aspects of religion. One of the other aspects, and this is quite a somber, sad aspect to actually be talking about, is that religion can also play an important role in how it incites violence against people. Can you briefly explain some of the work that has been going on before we then delve into your own research and your own empirical findings as well?
Yes. So there is, as you say, one of the reasons for studying religion is because we know religious conflict is prevalent right across the world, and many economists and others have been thinking about why it's the case that you're getting, conflict and hatred and so forth. And of course, one of the famous papers is Ed Glaser's paper on the political economy of hatred. This is this idea that, hatred as you see it is not irrational per se, but that there is a demand for hate speech on the one hand, because there are participants who want to hear hateful stories about another group. That could be a religious group, it could be a sports team, it could be just some other group. And at the same time, you have the supply of hateful messages that might be coming from politicians or media or clergy or whatever, to facilitate this demand. Some of this economics work has also been suggesting that the level of hatred also goes up with intergrouping differences, with inequality and so forth as well. It also depends a lot on funding. And so with that kind of background in terms of the economics research, a lot of the, economists who've been looking at this issue have then been looking at conflict in that kind of context, and then how it affects other outcomes. So, for example, in some of the work that I've been doing, we've been looking at religious riots and how it affects political outcomes. But the underlying model which is driving a lot of these developments is this idea of, what they're calling the political economy of hatred, essentially.
And what I think is really interesting about this model, and there's no way we'll be able to properly lay it out on a podcast, but it's like the role, as you said, that politicians play in this, and how they can often actually actively incite hatred. Can you talk about like what the motivations behind this are, and actually like what some of the tactical motivations behind this are?
So I haven't done very much research myself on what the motivations behind this could be. What I've looked at more is, if you have had religious riots, has it actually affected, for example, electoral outcomes? And if you can show that it has affected electoral outcomes in some fashion, then that would provide a very clear motive for, the inciting of religious violence. This is some work that I've been doing in the last few years as well. And I think that, there we are finding evidence that, if you have had a riot in a particular area, this affects the election outcome in the election, a year after the event has occurred, and that the effect on elections is of the order of about 5 to 7% of the vote share, an increase in the vote share caused by, an incident of religious conflict. Now, I think as economists, sometimes we're quite careful about attributing motives to this. So we're not saying the religious riot caused the increase. Well, no, we're saying the religious riot caused the increase in the vote share. What we're saying is we don't know fully the mechanisms behind which or why the riot itself was incited in the first place. It could be any number of causes. They could be political causes, economic causes, land disputes, other causes, religious causes. It could be, there are many different reasons that explain, the incidence of a riot. But what we're documenting essentially is that it does have this, outcome, this effect on electoral outcomes to increase the vote share of the ruling party is what we were arguing.
So let's actually delve into this work a bit more, because I'm actually really curious about how you came about with this headline figure, because it's a super interesting figure and super important as well, right? For showing that religious riots do have a political effect. But how on earth would you go about actually testing this? What was the process?
So I mean, to be honest, this is a finding we didn't really want to find, because the idea of the riot actually, putting a number on the religious riot, increasing the vote share in the Indian context. So let me explain the background. We're looking at state elections in India. We were looking at, the post-independence period after 1950 up until about 2006, and we're looking at riot outcome. We're looking to see whether, if there was a religious conflict between Hindus and Muslims, did this affect the state election result of the national party, the BJP? And we're showing that it increases the vote share of the BJP by 5 to 7% if there's a riot. Now, Luca, you're quite right to point out that, part of the problem with actually being able to say this is happening is that we've got what economists call endogeneity issues and so forth. So one of the things that we had to show is how did the causality go? Did it go from the riots to the elections, or was it that the elections was actually causing the riots? That's the obvious question somebody would ask. And so in order to investigate this, I should say that, many Indian journalists have been writing about this for many, many years, that, that the riots they felt were sometimes responsible for the outcomes. What we were doing was to try and show the causality. And the way we did this was to use something, and so I'm going to be a little technical here. It's something that, it's a strategy that economists use called an instrumental variable strategy. So essentially, in simple English, what we were trying to do is to say that when a riot actually occurs, it's probably occurring because people from different religious communities are mingling in crowded circumstances. So we looked at when a Hindu festival and Hindu festivals follow a lunar calendar. When a Hindu festival falls on a Friday, which is the holy day we know for Muslims, and then we're looking to see, and because the Hindu festival follows a lunar calendar, the dates for the festivals are essentially moving around every year. It's not like Christmas, which is always the 25th of December. The dates for the festivals are actually moving around. And so then you can see the probability of whether, if a Hindu festival falls on a Friday, does that variable, which we call the festival instrument, does it actually predict the incidence of the riots? Because we had, through an event study analysis, we had data on the riots. We then looked at the dates of the Hindu festivals and when they fell on Fridays for that whole period. And then we found that, when a Hindu festival falls on a Friday, this variable is predicting very well the incidence of the riot. And so then we can use that variable to look at its effects on, the election outcomes, which is the vote share of the BJP, and we find that effect is very strong, and it predicts, it's showing the 5 to 7% increase. So that's the way we demonstrated the causality. We were relying on the fact that lunar events are establishing the date of the festival, and we kind of hope the lunar events are not affecting the increase in the vote share.
So this then demonstrates, as you said, this causality, right? That it is actually these riots causing this increase in the vote share. But as you rightfully said, we don't really know the causal mechanism behind it. We don't know exactly what is happening here. However, in your article, you did look at kind of the results around your results a bit to kind of have a bit of a guess about what process is happening in people's minds. Can you talk a bit about what you found there and maybe speculate a bit about what this might mean, what is motivating people?
So in our work, we actually found that this effect was temporary. So it affected, it wasn't a permanent effect. So the riot can affect the electoral outcome, but then that effect doesn't persist. We did look at whether voter turnout may have been an important factor that affected this, but it wasn't voter turnout. We think that, as I said, we don't say very much about the mechanisms because we don't investigate the mechanisms explicitly. But all we can say is that the effect is transitory, it's temporary, in that it doesn't last more than the year. But what we do also show is that the effect of the riot is not just in the district, where the riot occurs, but may extend to about 4 districts away. That's the other finding we also show. So that was another aspect of the work that we were actually looking at, the sort of geographical, spatial distribution of how far the riot actually had the effect on the electoral outcome, because electoral constituencies and how far the influence of the riot extends may not necessarily be the same. So I think our feeling is that the riot does affect the electoral outcome, but it doesn't really affect it through the channel of voter turnout. It's not like people are scared and staying home because of the riot.
Can you just begin to speculate then about what this mechanism might be? Did you come up with any guesses, even if they're not, or even if they're still speculative?
So I think, the one guess I hope was not happening is that the riot was being incited in order to influence the election outcome. I mean, we have no evidence for this. There's a lot of journalistic writing in India which has been alluding to this for some time now. As I said, all we were doing was really just documenting the quantitative evidence. Does it really have an effect? And we're showing, yes, if you just look at the bare bones of the data, when a riot occurs, it's having the effect on the electoral outcome. I hope it's not because, people know that and that therefore the riot has actually been incited for whatever cause. I think the way to actually analyze this would be to go much more deeply into the causes of each of the riots, in each of the, years that we found. And we have the data on the causes, the purported causes of the riots. It was an event study, so we had to extract the data from Times of India newspaper reports. So we have a purported cause of the riot, but, again, this is where I think surveys would be really useful to actually go back and actually talk to people there about, what were the causes they felt for the riots, because even newspaper versions of reported incidents may have their own bias based on the bias of the newspaper and so forth as well. We actually try to correct for some of these things in the work, but I think you need a much more in-depth analysis of when a riot occurs, a very detailed case study of what were the circumstances in which it occurred and why, and that'll give you an insight into whether it was incited or whether it was there was some other natural cause for it that just exploded.
So there's a fairly bleak conclusion here, which is that, at least in the cases you looked at, religious riots and religious violence are reliably associated with an increase in vote share for the majority party. Majority in terms of number of votes, and also majority in the sense that they represent the majority religion. Do you think we can learn anything from this finding about what we might be able to do to limit this kind of religious violence?
Yeah, no, I think that's an extremely important question we need to be thinking much more about. I think, many economists in other contexts have written that when you have what they call low state capacity, so there's weak punishment, essentially, when, if you incite a riot, the punishment is weak, then you're much more likely to have instances of what we've just here described. So I think, one thing to focus on is making sure that, you have strong state capacity rather than, weak state capacity. The other area, which is what we were talking about earlier, is I think actually the provision of the public goods might help a lot in this respect. So one of the things I'm arguing is that when you're providing the non-religious services, the public goods and so forth, this actually mitigates the potential for conflict. If the conflict is arising over the distribution of water, the distribution of health, the distribution of credit and such things, if you're actually providing some of these basic services, that might mitigate the potential for conflict in the future among the very same groups that are engaging in the riot. So I think dealing with sort of institutions and state capacity, looking at public goods, and also I think there is a role here for the media as well. The reporting of riots, raising awareness about other religious communities, responsible media, legislation against discrimination. These are all the things I think that essentially will probably come out in terms of public policy that you can do in order to make sure that the riot is that we don't have this bleak conclusion. As I said, this was one of the few papers that Anand Srivastava and I wrote together where we really didn't like the finding that we found, and we reported it as scholars, as you must, but I hope it will also engender a wider discussion exactly along the lines that you're suggesting. What is it then that we can do to make sure that the conflict doesn't actually translate into the increase in the vote share.
And there is like a small silver lining to this, right? In the sense that you did find that this is just a temporary effect.
So there's a glimmer of hope in the findings.
The glimmer of hope.
So we've been talking about the economic relevance of religious institutions, for instance, in the sense that they provide non-religious services and goods. But obviously, just to talk about these things is to skirt around the fact that, to a large extent, religions are just a bundle of beliefs, right? And presumably some of those beliefs, like this idea of the Protestant work ethic, are going to affect culture and they're going to affect things like religious growth. Are there any beliefs in particular or religious attitudes which you haven't mentioned, which you think are really interesting and might be a good kind of object for further study?
In my work, I haven't looked so much at the role of beliefs influencing the economic activity. As we were talking earlier, I've been looking much more at the relationship, the other way around. But I think, where perhaps economists can contribute to this discussion of beliefs is actually doing a lot more what we call experimental economic studies of to try and parcel out the difference between beliefs on the one hand and other factors through which religion might operate. There is this methodology is used very commonly in other aspects of development economics. It's been used less in the context of religion, but I think that this may be an area where we can actually try and get at what are the beliefs that ultimately we think is going to have some effect on economic activity. And here it may be beliefs about areas like we were talking about earlier, areas like schooling and religious schooling in particular, that are actually quite important. I think that's going to be an area where you can do interesting economics research, where it does affect educational outcomes and eventually employment outcomes and so forth. And if these religious beliefs are important and they're complementary to other beliefs, then this might then affect the ability of a person to acquire an education, for example. There is some research, for example, that's shown that Jewish religious beliefs were very complementary for the Jewish community with secular education, and this was responsible for the success of the Jewish community in historical periods. So like that, I think research in those kinds of areas that's looking at religion and schooling, I think would actually be quite significant.
This isn't like a belief per se, but one interesting area as well is Islamic finance laws.
Yes.
Could you, and I know this isn't like necessarily your field of work per se, but for listeners interested in this, could you maybe highlight one or two studies for them to learn more?
Yes, I mean, I would definitely read the work of Timur Kuran, a professor at Duke University, who's written some wonderful books and articles that has talked specifically about the Islamic institutions that have affected development in the Middle East. You might also like to look at the work of Jared Rubin, who has a recent book in the last few years, which has also been looking at many of these economists have been looking at the Middle East compared to the West, and looking at, in particular, various legal institutions as well as financial institutions and practices that have been responsible for differential growth in these areas. This is absolutely a budding area of scholarship for people who are working, on that region. But definitely, Timur Kuran also has a wonderful paper that was published in the Journal of Economic Literature in the last couple of years, which is on Islam and economic development specifically. So if there are listeners out there who are interested in that area, I would certainly look at the work of these scholars.
So one way religion might also be important for economic growth is through its role as social capital and through its role in establishing trust as well. Can you just explain basically what that means?
Yes. So when we're thinking about social capital, or the economist's idea of social capital, we're really thinking about norms and networks that are based on notions of reciprocity. So membership of clubs and groups. This could be a football club, it could be a choir, it could be a religious group. So that's really what we're thinking about with social capital. And we think that these norms and networks are actually very important for the development of the individual and the development of the community. You get greater returns from being a member of a group if there are others who are also members of the same group. So, for example, if you learn a new language, if others also speak the same language, you get more benefit from learning the language because there's lots of people speaking the same language. So that benefit and essentially this externality that you get from being a member of a particular group, that's really where these notions of social capital are very important. And that's where religion also comes into it, because religion fosters, if you're with other co-religionists in your group, this might foster trust, this might foster networks of various kinds. And these norms and networks might actually be important for your own and for your community's development. So that's how religion ties in with these broader notions of trust and social capital.
Can you briefly explain the difference between bonding and bridging capital and why that distinction might be important?
Yes. So this was work that was actually done by Robert Putnam, my colleague here in the economics faculty, Professor Partha Dasgupta. Many people have written on these concepts. So the idea of bonding social capital is really where you're emphasizing the homogeneity and networks within a particular group. So we're thinking about, people who belong essentially to the same group. The bridging social capital is what sociologists call the strength of weak ties. So this is essentially where you're looking at links across groups. So in the first instance, for example, you might think of people who are members of the same choir or the same football club. They would be an example of bonding social capital. If we're thinking about relations between Hindus and Muslims in rural India, that could be an example of bridging social capital. You're thinking of ties across different communities. So the first is about vertical integration and so forth within the same group. The other is about integration across groups that are disparate. That's really the difference between the bonding and the bridging. And we would say both were important for development, I should add. We think that both bonding and bridging social capital are important for successful economic development.
We've talked about so much and so many different studies here in the economics of religion, but this is actually relatively a new field still. And I wanted to ask, being one of the pioneering researchers in this field, why do you think it has suddenly exploded over the last decades or so? And can you give us an insight about what areas might be at the forefront in the future?
So, Luca, that's very kind, but I should probably say that I'm not one of the pioneering researchers in the field. I think the person who actually talked about it was Adam Smith. He wrote first, actually, about the economics of religion about, 200 years ago. And then, for a very long time ago. And then economists kind of forgot about it in the middle. And then Larry Annacone and Gary Becker and Ellie Berman and many of these other scholars, did resurrect the field very much so, more recently. So I think, we if you actually go back to some of the classic economics texts, there is a lot of discussion about what we would today think of as the economics of religion, but which was not defined as the economics of religion in those days. I think you're absolutely right to say that more recently, in the last couple of decades, this field really has taken off. It is very much a new field in economics, but it has taken off. And I think it's partly been driven by new data that has become available on religion. So people have been able to work on it. It's been driven by lots of enthusiastic, motivated graduate students, I should say, who have been excited by this area and by this topic and are doing, even as we speak, wonderful PhDs and writing papers in this. Those of us who are part of this community working in this area have a very strong association that's called the Association for the Study of Religion, Economics and Culture. We have regular conferences and I had one in Cambridge a couple of years ago, and so there's been a lot of mushrooming of interest because the community has actually had very good social capital and there have been great graduate students. And I think fundamentally people are interested in interesting ideas and global phenomena. Religion is not going away, despite economic growth and changes in the wider world or COVID-19, or any of these changes. So I think, why we're seeing a significant rise in papers and books in this area is because it's an interesting phenomena. The ideas in it are challenging our young graduate students, and hopefully, all of us can provide them with the encouragement to take this field forward, in good ways in years to come.
In the next, let's say, 5 years or so of your own research, is there some particular question that you would really like to see answered?
So I've just started a project at the moment with Anand Srivastava, the co-author on the other paper, and Girish Behel in Australia on religion and COVID-19. So one of the things that, certainly we're doing even now is to, given the circumstances in which all of us have found ourselves, is actually to look at whether religious networks influenced at all the spread of the disease, and what has been the effect of religion on people's mental health in a period where they couldn't get direct access to religious services in a conventional way. So this is a project which we've been actually embarked on and doing. We're conducting surveys at the moment. They're online surveys, obviously not in-person surveys. We're doing it in the US at the moment. Depending on whether we can get grant funding, we'll see whether we can extend it to other countries. But this is the immediate project that I'm working on at the moment. There's also other projects which we're doing on religion and labor markets in India, which is carrying on from previous research. But I think the immediate project is definitely looking at whether this crisis, which we know has had so many effects on other aspects of the economy, whether it's also affected religion as well.
Has studying religion influenced your own faith? Or is that a bit like asking someone who studies the economics of crime whether they are themselves a criminal?
Yeah. No, I mean, I have always been religious, and Hindu and so forth. I think where the study of religion has helped me greatly is that it's actually made me more interested in other faiths. And I've learned a lot about, religions I didn't, religious traditions I didn't grow up in. And that's actually been extremely rewarding for somebody who studies religion. I don't think being a scholar of religion has necessarily impacted, has either increased or decreased, the level of faith I already had. But it's definitely widened my understanding and knowledge of other religious traditions. And that's been a tremendously rewarding experience.
Yeah, super. Okay, penultimate question, which we ask everyone. What significant thing have you recently changed your mind about, and why?
So actually, I think, on a flippant level, the working from home, I've suddenly realized how much one can actually do from home, compared to my earlier lifestyle. On a more serious note, with respect to our conversations about religion, the secularization thesis, I think, I initially, when I started working in this area, I did think secularization would happen automatically. That's the one thing I've definitely, changed my mind about. I don't see the influence of religion going away anytime soon, certainly not in my lifetime.
Okay, very last question. What 3 books or articles, films, whatever else, would you recommend for anyone interested in finding out more about everything that we've talked about?
Okay, so there's a lot out there you can read, but I would go with so Larry Iannacone is in some ways the founder of this field. I think he's written a very nice paper called An Introduction to the Economics of Religion, which was published in the Journal of Economic Literature in the 90s. I did an update of that in the same journal in 2016, and Timur Kuran's paper, we've already talked about that, on Islam and development. So that's certainly, I think someone, those 3 JEL papers may be useful for an initial introduction. I've just finished reading a wonderful book, which I would recommend. It's called Persecution and Toleration, The Long Road to Religious Freedom by Noel Johnson and Mark Koyama. It's looking at the growth of religious freedom in medieval Europe and how that then paved the way for the development of nationalism and liberalism and all of these ideas, and the role particularly of state capacity and treatment of religious minorities and so forth. That's a great book. I would again recommend reading that. And if you're interested particularly in the Middle East, there's a fantastic paper by our colleague at Oxford, Eric Cheney. He published a paper in a journal in economics called Econometrica in 2013, and it's about the relationship between religious structures and political processes in Egypt. Again, so I would recommend these 3 main JEL papers, the Johnson-Koyama book, and the Cheney paper in Econometrica.
And because you weren't too humble to mention your own, I'll just say you've got your own book as well, The Economics of Religion in India.
Thank you, Luca.
Which is very accessible and a great read. And you also co-edited Advances in the Economics of Religion, which is a bit more technical for listeners who really want to delve in deeper.
That's very kind. Thank you so much, Luca.
Sriya Iyer, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Sriya Iyer on the Economics of Religion. As always, if you want to learn more, you can read the write-up at hearthisidea.com/episodes/Sriya. There you'll find links to all the papers and books referenced in our conversation, as well as a blog post explaining the key ideas we discussed. We would be very grateful if you could leave an honest review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this. If you have constructive feedback, there is also a link on the website to an anonymous form, or you can get in touch with us directly by emailing feedback@hearthisidea.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to support the show more directly and help us pay for hosting these episodes online, you can leave a tip by following a link in the description. Thanks very much for listening.